Beyond the massive stone gates and the cold, unyielding walls lies a secret world of survival. Long before the first grain was stored, the very land around the castle was already breathing life into its larders. The winding paths, the shaded orchards, and the dark woodland edges weren't just scenery. They were the beginning of a long, silent journey. Tonight, we uncover how an ancient fortress transformed the earth's harvest into a hidden treasure of sustenance. Step into the quiet geography where time slows down, and the stones themselves hold the scent of centuries. If you are listening at night, tell me where you are and what time it is. Welcome to Dreamy Old Stories, where we share slow and gentle stories from history. These stories are made to calm your mind and help you fall asleep. The castle rises from its surroundings not as an isolated structure, but as something placed within a wide and varied landscape that stretches far beyond its walls. Low fields extend outward in soft, uneven lines, their surfaces marked by furrows that follow the shape of the land rather than any strict pattern. Beyond them, orchards gather in small clusters, their trees spaced with quiet intention, each one shaped by years of slow growth. A river bends at a distance, its course determined long before the castle existed, moving through earth that has shifted gradually over centuries. Farther still, the darker edge of woodland stands where the ground lifts slightly, forming a boundary that feels natural rather than constructed. The air across this land carries a mixture of faint impressions that change depending on where one stands. Near the fields, there is the dry scent of soil turned by tools, mixed with the softer presence of growing plants that release a subtle freshness. In the orchards, the atmosphere feels thicker, touched by the sweetness of fruit that has not yet been gathered. Close to the river, the air cools and takes on a damp quality, brushing against the skin in a way that feels gentle but noticeable. Even the distant woodland contributes its own presence, a deeper scent that travels outward, bringing with it something shaded and earthy that settles quietly into the senses. As days pass, small shifts begin to appear across this wide terrain, though none of them arrive suddenly. The fields change in color, moving from darker tones to lighter ones as growth progresses, then gradually returning again after harvest. Trees in the orchards adjust their shape as branches take on new weight, leaves thickening before thinning once more. The river alters its pace depending on unseen influences, sometimes moving with greater fullness, at other times revealing more of its banks. Even the woodland edge seems to adjust in subtle ways, as light filters through differently, creating variations that can be noticed only over time rather than in a single moment. For those who depend on this land, there is an understanding that forms slowly, built not through instruction but through quiet familiarity. The distance between field and castle is not measured only in space, but in the effort required to carry what grows there. The quality of soil is not simply observed, but felt through the outcomes it produces across seasons. The river becomes more than a visible feature, offering a sense of timing and expectation that shapes decisions without being spoken. In this way, the land is not separate from the castle at all, but part of a larger rhythm that determines what will one day arrive at its gates. The paths that connect the outer land to the castle do not follow straight intentions. They curve gently, shaped by repeated passage rather than design, pressing into the earth where footsteps and wheels have found the easiest way forward. Some are narrow, bordered by grass that leans inward as if reclaiming space between uses, while others widen near open fields where movement gathers more often. Small rises in the land interrupt these routes, forcing them to adjust, dipping and climbing in response to slopes that cannot be ignored. Stones emerge in certain places, worn smooth by contact, while softer ground elsewhere holds faint impressions that fade and return with each passing day. Walking along these paths brings a sequence of quiet sensations that shift with each step. The ground underfoot feels different depending on where the path leads, sometimes firm and dry, sometimes softer with a slight give that responds to pressure. The air changes gradually as one moves, carrying traces of distant elements that become clearer and then recede again. A faint breeze may pass across open stretches, touching the face briefly before moving on, while in more enclosed areas the air feels closer, holding its presence for longer. Sounds travel unevenly here, sometimes carried clearly across open ground, other times softened by distance or absorbed into the surrounding landscape. Along these routes, movement unfolds in a steady but varied manner, shaped by the needs of those who travel them. A cart may pass slowly, its weight pressing deeper into the earth, leaving marks that remain visible for a time before softening again. Individuals walk at different paces, some pausing briefly to adjust what they carry, others continuing without interruption. At certain points, paths intersect, creating moments where directions meet and then separate again. These interactions do not alter the path itself, but they leave small signs of presence, subtle changes that mark where activity has recently occurred before gradually blending back into the surface. Over time, these paths become more than simple connections between places. They form a kind of memory within the land, holding the repeated actions of those who rely on them. Each curve and dip reflects choices made without conscious thought, guided by comfort, effort, and familiarity. The journey along them is not only about reaching the castle, but about participating in a pattern that has developed slowly through use. In this way, the land does not merely support movement, but quietly records it, shaping how food and goods find their way inward, long before they come to rest within stone walls. Beyond the open fields and winding paths, there are smaller spaces that do not immediately draw attention, yet they contribute in quiet and essential ways. Low marshy areas gather where water settles after rain, forming soft ground that supports certain plants while resisting others. Hedges grow along the edges of cultivated land, not in straight lines but in uneven stretches that follow older boundaries, marking where one use of land gives way to another. Scattered stones lie partially buried, some too large to move, shaping how tools are used and how soil is turned. These details sit close to the ground, often unnoticed from a distance, yet they influence what can grow and how easily it can be gathered. Moving through these smaller spaces brings a different kind of awareness, one that rests closer to the surface of the land. The ground in marshy patches holds moisture that can be felt through each careful step, creating a slower pace as weight shifts with more attention. Near hedges, the air carries a layered scent, a mix of leaves, damp soil, and the faint presence of insects that move within the branches. The texture of the earth changes underfoot, sometimes firm with roots beneath it, sometimes uneven where stones press upward from below. These sensations do not demand focus, but they gather quietly, shaping how the land is experienced without needing to be named. Over time, these areas adjust in ways that are subtle yet steady, influenced by patterns that extend beyond immediate sight. Marshes expand slightly during wetter periods, then retreat again as the ground dries, leaving behind traces of where water once rested. Hedges grow thicker or thinner depending on how often they are cut back, their shape shifting gradually as seasons pass. Stones may become more exposed after repeated contact with tools or weather, altering how nearby soil behaves. Each change unfolds slowly, not as a sudden event but as a continuation of what has already begun, forming a landscape that is always in quiet development. Those who spend time within these spaces come to recognize their quiet influence, even if it is not spoken aloud. A certain patch of ground may be avoided when carrying weight, not because it is forbidden, but because experience has shown how it responds. The presence of a hedge may suggest where to gather certain materials, offering a sense of place that is understood through repeated contact. Even the stones, fixed in their position, guide actions by requiring adjustment rather than resistance. In this way, these smaller parts of the land shape behavior gently, contributing to the larger process of what eventually reaches the castle, long before any food is stored within its walls. Further outward, where the land stretches beyond what can be easily walked in a single day, there are wider patterns that shape the region as a whole. Gentle hills rise and fall in long, uneven waves, creating areas that receive more sunlight and others that hold shade for longer hours. Valleys gather between them, forming natural channels where water collects and soil becomes richer over time. In some places, the ground becomes lighter and more brittle, while in others it deepens into darker layers that hold moisture more easily. These larger formations do not draw attention in detail, yet they quietly influence where certain crops can grow and where others cannot take hold. To move through this wider terrain is to experience a gradual shift in atmosphere that unfolds over distance rather than moments. Air feels warmer on open slopes where sunlight rests longer, while lower ground carries a cooler presence that lingers even after the day has advanced. The effort of walking changes as well, with gentle inclines asking for a slower pace, and downward paths offering brief ease before rising again. Sounds travel differently across these spaces, sometimes carried across valleys in a softened echo, sometimes fading quickly when absorbed by uneven ground. The body becomes aware of these differences not through thought, but through a steady adjustment to each new stretch of land. Across seasons, these larger areas undergo changes that are noticeable only when remembered over time. Hills that once held a softer green take on a drier tone as conditions shift, while valleys deepen in color when moisture gathers more consistently. The distribution of growth adjusts slowly, with certain areas becoming more productive while others offer less. Even the patterns of water alter their paths slightly, influenced by repeated rainfall and the shape of the ground beneath it. These changes do not arrive as disruptions, but as quiet progressions that guide what the land is able to provide in each passing cycle. For those connected to this wider landscape, there is a sense of distance that carries meaning beyond simple measurement. The journey from these outer areas to the castle is not only about space, but about the effort required to bring what grows there into a place of storage. Each rise and fall of the land adds to that effort, shaping decisions about what is worth carrying and what is left behind. Over time, this understanding becomes part of how the land is read, not as a map, but as a lived experience. In this way, the broader geography quietly determines not only what can grow, but what will eventually find its way inward. Closer to the edges of cultivation, where managed land begins to soften into something less defined, there are transition zones that do not belong entirely to one use or another. Grasses grow taller here, bending in uneven directions, shaped by wind rather than tools. Small clusters of wild plants gather in open patches, filling spaces that are left between more deliberate forms of growth. The boundary between field and uncultivated ground is not marked by any clear line, but by a gradual blending of textures and colors that shift over short distances. These areas do not appear planned, yet they hold a quiet structure that influences what can be gathered and what remains untouched. To stand within these spaces is to notice a different arrangement of sensation, one that feels less ordered but not disorganized. The air carries a mixture of scents that do not separate cleanly, combining elements of grass, soil, and distant vegetation into a single presence that is difficult to define. The ground underfoot varies from step to step, sometimes firm, sometimes uneven, requiring small adjustments in balance that happen almost without awareness. There is a light movement in the air that passes through taller growth, brushing against it and creating a faint sound that rises and falls without pattern. These impressions come together softly, forming an experience that is subtle yet layered. Over time, these transition areas respond to influences that arrive from multiple directions, shaping them in ways that are neither fully controlled nor entirely natural. Paths may begin to form where repeated passage presses the ground, though they remain less defined than those closer to the castle. Certain plants spread outward, while others recede, depending on how often the area is crossed or left alone. The edges of cultivated land may extend slightly into these spaces, or withdraw from them, creating a shifting boundary that adjusts with use. These changes do not follow a fixed direction, but unfold through a balance of presence and absence that varies across seasons. For those who move between cultivated and uncultivated ground, these areas hold a quiet significance that is felt rather than spoken. They offer a sense of transition, where one kind of activity gives way to another, not through a clear shift, but through gradual change. The experience of passing through them becomes familiar over time, shaping expectations about what lies ahead and what has been left behind. In this way, these spaces contribute to the larger rhythm of the land, guiding movement and gathering in subtle ways that influence what will eventually be brought toward the castle for storage. At certain distances from the castle, the land begins to feel less connected to its immediate influence, though it still contributes in ways that are not immediately visible. Here, scattered clearings appear between stretches of woodland, where sunlight reaches the ground in uneven patterns. Small streams move quietly through these areas, narrower than the river but steady in their own course, shaping the soil around them. The ground may rise unexpectedly, forming shallow ridges that interrupt movement and redirect it gently. These outer spaces are not defined by the presence of the castle, yet they remain part of the wider environment that supports what eventually arrives within its walls. To move through these more distant areas is to notice a shift in how the surroundings are experienced. The air feels less shaped by human activity, carrying a cleaner, more open quality that changes gradually with each step. The sounds that emerge here are softer and more dispersed, blending into the background rather than standing apart. The ground responds differently as well, with textures that feel less worn, offering a sense of variation that requires attention without effort. These sensations do not announce themselves, but they create a quiet awareness of being further from the center, where patterns are less defined and more loosely arranged. Over time, these distant parts of the landscape follow their own gradual developments, influenced by conditions that are not always visible from within the castle grounds. Clearings may expand as light reaches further into wooded areas, or narrow again as growth returns. Streams adjust their paths slightly, responding to the shape of the land and the movement of water over long periods. The balance between open and enclosed space shifts slowly, creating subtle changes in how the land can be used. These developments do not occur with any clear intention, yet they contribute to the broader pattern of what the environment is able to provide. For those who consider the full reach of the land, there is an understanding that extends beyond what can be easily seen or accessed. These distant areas may not be visited often, yet they remain part of a larger system that supports the castle over time. What grows here, what moves through these spaces, and what conditions shape them all play a role in determining what is possible elsewhere. The connection is not immediate, but it is continuous, forming a quiet link between distance and presence. In this way, even the farthest parts of the landscape participate in the slow and steady process that defines how food begins its journey toward storage. The outer gate of the castle stands as a threshold where open land narrows into a controlled passage, framed by thick stone that rises higher than the eye naturally follows. The ground leading toward it bears the marks of repeated use, pressed down by wheels and footsteps that have passed over it across many seasons. Wooden doors, reinforced with bands of iron, remain partially open during daylight hours, allowing a steady flow of movement inward. Along the sides, low walls guide approaching carts into a single direction, shaping how each arrival unfolds. Nothing about the space feels hurried, yet its structure quietly directs everything that enters. As carts draw closer, the surrounding air begins to shift in subtle ways that can be felt before anything is fully seen. The scent of the open fields lingers behind, while a heavier presence gathers near the gate, shaped by stone, wood, and the faint trace of stored goods that have passed through before. The sound of wheels changes as they roll from softer earth onto more compacted ground, producing a deeper, more solid tone. Harnesses creak with each step of the animals pulling the load, and quiet voices move between those guiding the carts, blending into the atmosphere without rising above it. Movement through the gate follows a rhythm that forms through repetition rather than instruction. A cart slows as it approaches, adjusting its pace to match the narrowing space, then continues forward once aligned with the entrance. Hands reach to steady loads, making small corrections as the surface beneath shifts slightly from outside to inside. One cart passes through, followed by another, each separated by brief pauses that allow space to open again. The transition from light into shadow happens gradually, as the brightness of the open land gives way to the more enclosed tone within the gate, marking a clear but gentle shift. For those who move through this space each day, the act of arrival becomes something familiar, understood without the need for attention. The gate is not simply an entry point, but a place where distance begins to settle into presence. What has been carried across fields and along paths now reaches a point of transfer, where effort changes into placement. There is a quiet recognition in this moment, a sense that the journey outside has ended and another process is about to begin. The experience does not demand reflection, yet it leaves a subtle impression of transition that lingers beyond the crossing itself. Just inside the gate, the space opens slightly into a narrow inner court where carts pause before moving deeper into the castle grounds. The stone beneath becomes more even, shaped by deliberate placement rather than repeated passing. Low platforms stand along the sides, worn smooth at the edges from years of use, offering a place where loads can be set down or adjusted. Openings in the surrounding walls lead toward different parts of the castle, each one directing goods along a specific route. The structure here does not announce itself, yet it quietly organizes the flow, guiding where each item will go next. The atmosphere within this space carries a different quality, shaped by enclosure and the presence of stored materials. The air feels slightly cooler, touched by the shade that gathers between the walls. There is a faint mixture of scents, dry grain from open sacks, the sharp trace of wood from barrels, and something heavier that settles near the ground where goods have rested. Sounds behave differently here, no longer dispersing into open space but returning in softened echoes. Footsteps, quiet voices, and the movement of carts blend together, forming a low, continuous presence that fills the area without drawing attention to any single source. As each cart comes to a halt, a series of small actions begins to unfold, each one connected to the task of transferring what has been carried. Hands reach upward to untie ropes, loosening the tension that has held bundles in place during the journey. Sacks are lifted with measured effort, shifted from wood to stone, their weight briefly suspended before settling again. Barrels are rolled carefully, guided by steady pressure to keep them from moving too quickly. These actions follow one another in a sequence that feels practiced, not rushed, with each movement creating space for the next without interruption. Those who work in this area develop a quiet awareness of how things arrive and where they belong. There is no need to pause and consider each step, as familiarity shapes the flow of activity. The weight of a sack, the balance of a barrel, the direction of a passage all become understood through repetition over time. In this way, the space inside the gate becomes more than a place of arrival, it becomes a point of understanding, where the effort of travel is recognized and gently transformed into the beginning of storage. Near the inner edge of the gateway, there are narrow alcoves set into the stone, shallow spaces that hold simple tools and objects used during arrival. Wooden poles lean against the wall, their surfaces worn smooth where hands have gripped them many times. Coiled rope rests in loose loops, ready to be drawn out and used again. There are low benches, uneven in shape, where items can be placed briefly before being moved onward. The stone here carries faint marks, lines and scuffs that suggest repeated contact, forming a quiet record of how this space has been used over time without any need for decoration or attention. To remain in this area for a while is to notice how the senses begin to adjust to its enclosed rhythm. The scent of rope fibers and aged wood mixes with the faint dust that rises when sacks are shifted, creating a dry presence in the air. The temperature feels steady, protected from the direct heat outside, allowing a more even sensation against the skin. There is a soft pattern of sound that continues without interruption, the low friction of objects being moved, the quiet contact of materials against stone, and the subtle exchange of voices that remain close to the ground rather than carrying outward. Within this setting, small adjustments happen constantly, each one shaping the process in quiet ways. A sack may be repositioned slightly to prevent it from leaning too far, or a rope tightened again when its hold begins to loosen. Tools are picked up, used briefly, then returned to their place without ceremony. The position of each object shifts in response to immediate need, creating a subtle pattern of change that moves through the space. These actions do not stand out on their own, yet together they form a continuous flow that supports everything passing through. Over time, those who move within this space begin to sense its patterns without needing to observe them directly. The placement of tools, the feel of the ground, the distance between one task and the next all become part of an internal understanding that guides movement. There is a quiet confidence that comes from this familiarity, allowing each action to unfold without hesitation. In this way, the area just inside the gate becomes more than a place of work. It becomes a space where knowledge is held in the body, shaping how food continues its journey inward. Beyond the immediate unloading space, the passage begins to divide, leading toward inner corridors that carry goods further into the castle. The walls narrow slightly, guiding movement into single directions that prevent crossing paths from becoming tangled. Open doorways appear at intervals, each one marked by its position rather than any visible sign, known through use rather than instruction. The floor bears a smoother finish here, shaped by more controlled movement, with fewer irregularities than the ground outside. Light enters unevenly through small openings above, creating a shifting pattern across the stone that moves slowly as the day progresses. As one moves through these inner passages, the sensory experience becomes more enclosed and focused. The air holds a denser quality, shaped by the surrounding walls and the presence of goods that have already been brought inside. Sounds no longer spread outward but return in softened layers, footsteps following one another in quiet succession. The scent of stored materials grows more noticeable, with traces of grain, wood, and dried goods blending into a steady presence that settles into the space. Even the temperature feels more contained, neither influenced by open air nor entirely separate from it, creating a balanced atmosphere. The movement of goods continues here in a more directed flow, shaped by the structure of the passage itself. Items are carried or rolled forward with careful attention to space, ensuring that each path remains clear for what follows. A brief pause may occur at a doorway as one group passes through, then movement resumes once the way opens again. Hands guide objects along walls to keep them steady, adjusting their course in response to the narrowing path. These actions unfold with quiet coordination, each person responding to the space and to one another without the need for spoken direction. For those who pass through these corridors regularly, there is a growing sense of orientation that does not rely on sight alone. The shape of the passage, the feel of the floor beneath each step, and the way sound returns from the walls all contribute to an internal map that guides movement. There is no need to consider each turn, as familiarity carries the body forward with quiet assurance. In this way, the journey inward becomes less about distance and more about recognition, as each step moves deeper into a space that is already understood. At certain points along these inner routes, small interruptions appear in the form of thresholds, slight changes in floor level, or narrow turns that require a shift in movement. The stone may rise just enough to be noticed underfoot, or dip slightly where repeated passage has worn it down. Door frames stand lower than expected, encouraging a natural lowering of posture as goods are carried through. Corners tighten briefly before opening again, guiding the body to adjust its path with care. These features are not obstacles, yet they shape the flow inward, creating moments where movement becomes more deliberate and attentive. The experience of passing through these subtle changes brings a heightened awareness to each step and motion. The feel of the floor shifts underfoot, from smooth stone to a slightly rougher surface, offering a quiet signal that the space has altered. Hands respond instinctively, tightening their hold on what is carried as balance adjusts to the new angle or height. The air feels different near these points, sometimes cooler where less light reaches, or slightly warmer where openings allow a trace of outside presence to enter. These sensory details gather gently, guiding action without requiring thought. As goods continue to move through these areas, each small feature shapes how the process unfolds. A slight pause may occur as a cart is guided carefully over a raised edge, its wheels lifted or steadied to prevent uneven movement. Carried items shift position as individuals adjust their grip to pass through narrower sections. Movement slows briefly, then resumes once the space allows for it again. These adjustments are brief but consistent, forming a pattern of response that repeats with each passage, allowing the flow to continue without disruption. Over time, these minor interruptions become part of an unspoken understanding that guides everyone who moves through them. There is no need to anticipate each change, as the body learns to respond through familiarity and repetition. The awareness of space becomes internal, shaping how each step is placed and how each object is carried. In this way, the passage inward is not only a movement through structure, but an ongoing interaction with the space itself, where even the smallest details influence how food continues its journey deeper into the castle. Deeper within the castle, the passage finally opens into a wider receiving area where the movement of goods begins to slow into something more settled. The space is defined by thicker pillars that rise upward to support the weight above, creating intervals that divide the room into quiet sections. Along the edges, there are designated places where items are gathered before being carried further inward, marked not by signs but by long use. The floor shows fewer marks of travel here and more signs of placement, with faint impressions left where weight has rested for a time. The structure of the room guides the final stage of arrival, where movement begins to soften into stillness. The atmosphere within this receiving space carries a deeper, more layered presence that reflects everything that has passed through it. The air feels slightly heavier, holding traces of grain, dried goods, and the wood of containers that have been handled repeatedly. Sounds settle differently here, no longer shaped by passage or direction, but gathering into a low, continuous tone that fills the room. There is a quiet warmth that lingers, shaped by enclosed stone and the presence of stored items, creating an environment that feels both contained and active at the same time. As each load reaches this point, the actions begin to shift from movement to placement. Sacks are lowered carefully, their weight transferred from hands to ground in a controlled motion. Barrels are guided into position, rolled into place, and then steadied to prevent further movement. Bundles are untied and adjusted, preparing them for the next stage of handling. These actions unfold with a measured pace, each one completing the journey that began far beyond the castle walls. The rhythm here is different, no longer about forward motion, but about careful transition. For those who stand within this space, there is a quiet awareness that something has been completed, even if only for a moment. The effort of distance has been brought to an end, and what was once carried now rests within the structure of the castle itself. This point of arrival holds a subtle sense of closure, where the outside world gives way fully to the interior. Yet it also suggests continuation, as each item will soon move again, deeper into storage. In this way, the arrival at the gate is not a final moment, but a quiet turning point within a longer, ongoing process. Beneath the visible structure of the castle, a series of chambers extends into the ground, shaped by stone that has been cut and placed with deliberate care. The ceilings are low in some areas and slightly arched in others, distributing weight evenly across the space above. Walls are thick and uneven to the touch, their surfaces marked by the tools that once shaped them. Narrow stairways descend from upper levels, guiding movement downward into a cooler, dimmer environment. Small openings appear high along certain walls, allowing only a faint suggestion of light to enter, just enough to outline the structure without fully revealing it. The air within these rooms carries a distinct presence that settles gently against the skin. It feels cooler than the spaces above, holding a quiet density that seems to slow each breath without effort. There is a subtle scent that lingers throughout, a mixture of stone, stored grain, and aged wood, blending into something that feels grounded and contained. Sound behaves differently here, softening as it meets the walls, creating a sense of closeness that surrounds every movement. Even the faintest step produces a quiet response, absorbed quickly into the space rather than carried outward. From time to time, small changes move through these chambers, though they unfold gradually rather than all at once. A faint shift in air may pass through when an upper door is opened, bringing with it a brief difference in temperature before settling again. The position of stored items adjusts slightly as they are placed or removed, creating subtle variations in how the space is arranged. Light changes slowly as the day progresses above, altering the way shadows fall along the walls and floor. These changes do not interrupt the atmosphere, but gently reshape it over time. To remain in such a place for a while brings a quiet awareness of depth and separation from the world above. The sense of distance is not measured in steps, but in the way sound and light are reduced, creating an environment that feels removed from daily movement. There is a calm understanding that what is kept here is held with intention, protected by the very structure that surrounds it. In this way, the chambers beneath the castle become more than storage. They become a space where time feels slower and presence feels more grounded. Within these underground rooms, the arrangement of space is shaped by careful use rather than decoration. Rows of shelves extend along certain walls, built from thick wooden planks supported by simple frames that rest firmly against the stone. In other areas, the floor itself becomes the primary surface, where barrels and sacks are placed in deliberate groupings that follow an internal order. Narrow walkways remain between these sections, just wide enough to allow passage without disturbing what has been set down. The structure of the room guides placement quietly, creating a pattern that reflects purpose without needing visible markers. To move through these arranged spaces is to experience a layered set of sensations that build gradually. The coolness of the air deepens slightly closer to the ground, where stored goods rest in contact with stone. The scent of grain becomes more noticeable near open sacks, while wooden barrels carry a faint trace of what they contain, adding a subtle variation to the atmosphere. The texture underfoot shifts between smoother stone and areas where dust has settled lightly, creating a soft difference in each step. These details do not stand apart, but gather together, forming a quiet awareness of the space. As items are brought into these rooms, their placement follows a sequence that unfolds with measured attention. A sack is carried inward and lowered carefully into position, its weight transferring slowly as hands release their hold. Barrels are rolled along the floor with controlled movement, guided into place where they will rest securely. Once positioned, each item becomes part of the larger arrangement, contributing to a pattern that evolves over time. The space adjusts gently with each addition, expanding its structure without altering its overall sense of order. For those who spend time within these chambers, there is a growing familiarity with how the space is organized and how it responds to use. The position of each item becomes known not through observation alone, but through repeated interaction with the environment. Movement becomes more intuitive, guided by an internal sense of where things belong and how they are arranged. In this way, the storage rooms beneath the castle are not only places where food is kept, but spaces where understanding develops quietly through presence and experience. Along the deeper edges of these chambers, the stone reveals a different character, shaped less by construction and more by long contact with the earth itself. The walls feel slightly damp in certain sections, where moisture gathers in fine layers that darken the surface. Small ledges appear naturally within the stone, formed by uneven cuts or gradual wear, offering places where smaller containers are set aside. The floor in these areas slopes almost imperceptibly, guiding any collected moisture toward shallow channels that run along the base of the walls. These details are subtle, yet they shape how the space is used and understood. To spend time near these deeper sections is to notice a shift in how the environment feels against the body. The air carries a cooler touch here, with a faint dampness that rests lightly on the skin. There is a quieter scent, less influenced by stored goods and more by the stone itself, carrying an earthy depth that feels grounded and steady. Sounds soften further in these areas, as if absorbed more completely, leaving only the closest movements to be heard. Even breathing feels slightly different, slower and more measured, as the atmosphere encourages a gentle pace. Occasionally, small changes move through this part of the chamber, shaped by the conditions of the surrounding earth. Moisture gathers and recedes along the walls, leaving faint marks that shift over time. The position of items placed here may adjust slightly as surfaces respond to these subtle variations, requiring occasional repositioning to maintain balance. Light, already limited, alters gently as it reaches these deeper points, creating soft differences in how shapes are perceived. These changes unfold gradually, blending into the ongoing presence of the space rather than interrupting it. For those who come to understand these deeper areas, there is a quiet awareness of how the environment itself participates in the act of storage. The stone, the moisture, and the enclosed air all contribute to how food is kept over time, shaping conditions without direct control. This awareness is not spoken, but felt through repeated experience, guiding decisions about where certain items are placed. In this way, the deeper parts of the chamber become more than extensions of space. They become active elements within the process, quietly influencing what they hold. In some parts of the chamber, the ceiling lowers further, creating narrower sections where movement naturally slows. These areas are shaped by thicker stone overhead, forming shallow arches that press downward into the space, giving a sense of weight that feels closer than in the wider sections. Wooden beams appear in certain places, not as decoration but as support, their surfaces darkened over time by the surrounding air. Storage here adapts to the reduced height, with smaller containers placed carefully beneath these lowered spans, arranged in ways that allow passage without contact against the overhead stone. Passing through these tighter sections brings a different kind of physical awareness, where the body adjusts to the shape of the space without conscious effort. The air feels slightly more enclosed, holding a closer presence that settles around each movement. The scent of wood becomes more noticeable here, blending with the surrounding stone to create a deeper, warmer tone within the cooler environment. Sounds become softer still, confined within the lower ceiling, where even small motions feel more contained. Each step carries a quieter weight, guided by the closeness of the structure above. Movement within these areas follows a careful rhythm shaped by the space itself. Items are carried at a lower angle, hands adjusting their hold to prevent contact with the ceiling. A slight pause may occur as someone passes beneath a beam, allowing enough space to continue without disruption. Containers are shifted into position with attention to height as well as placement, ensuring they fit comfortably within the reduced space. These adjustments are small but consistent, forming a pattern of action that responds directly to the physical limits of the room. For those familiar with these sections, there is an understanding that extends beyond simple navigation. The lowered ceiling and confined passages create a sense of closeness that influences how the space is experienced. It encourages a quieter presence, where movement becomes more deliberate and awareness more focused. In this way, these narrower areas are not simply parts of the chamber, but spaces that shape behavior through their form, guiding how food is handled and how the environment is approached. Along certain walls, there are sections where the stone has been shaped into shallow recesses, forming quiet pockets within the larger chamber. These indentations are not uniform in size, some wide enough to hold stacked containers, others narrow and suited only for a few small items. Their edges are uneven, softened slightly over time by contact and use. In a few places, wooden planks have been fitted into these recesses, creating simple tiers that extend the available space. The arrangement feels integrated into the wall itself, as though storage has become part of the structure rather than something placed within it. To stand near these recessed areas is to notice how the surrounding air carries a slightly different character. The space feels closer, shaped by the inward curve of stone that gathers the atmosphere more tightly. The scent of stored goods becomes more concentrated here, held within the shallow depth of the recess before dispersing into the larger room. There is a softness to the sound as well, where even small movements seem to settle quickly, absorbed by the surrounding surfaces. The experience is subtle, yet it creates a sense of being enclosed within a smaller part of the larger chamber. As items are placed within these recesses, their arrangement follows the contours of the space rather than any fixed pattern. Containers are positioned to fit the available depth, sometimes stacked carefully, sometimes set side by side depending on their shape. When one item is removed, another may take its place, adjusting the balance of what is held there. Over time, the contents of each recess shift gently, reflecting the ongoing movement of goods through the chamber. These changes do not disrupt the space, but quietly reshape how it is used. For those who work within these rooms, the recessed sections offer a sense of familiarity that comes from repeated interaction. Each one holds a quiet memory of what has been placed there before, guiding future use without the need for instruction. The shape of the stone, the depth of the space, and the way items fit within it all become part of an internal understanding. In this way, these small pockets within the walls contribute to the larger process of storage, holding not only food, but a subtle knowledge of how space and purpose come together. At the furthest ends of these underground chambers, where fewer footsteps reach and the arrangement of goods becomes more sparse, the structure of the space begins to feel less defined by use and more by the natural limits of the stone itself. The walls close in slightly, not through design but through the original shape of the excavation, where cutting deeper was either unnecessary or too difficult. The floor may rise gently toward these ends, creating a sense of gradual elevation that is felt more than seen. There are fewer containers here, placed with intention rather than frequency, leaving more open ground between them. To remain in these quieter edges is to experience a softer, more distant atmosphere compared to the central areas. The air feels cooler and carries a deeper earth-like quality, less influenced by the constant presence of stored goods. Sound becomes faint, reduced to the nearest movement, with little echo returning from beyond. The scent of the stone grows more noticeable, blending with a subtle trace of dampness that lingers near the walls. Even the sense of space changes, as the openness between items creates a feeling of quiet separation within the enclosure. Over time, these outer sections shift in ways that are almost unnoticeable unless observed across long intervals. The arrangement of items changes only occasionally, with additions or removals happening less frequently than in more active areas. The surface of the stone may show slight alterations where moisture gathers and fades, leaving faint marks that trace the passing of time. Light, already minimal, reaches these areas in even softer forms, creating gentle variations in shadow that shift slowly throughout the day. These changes unfold with a quiet continuity that blends into the deeper character of the space. For those who become familiar with these distant parts of the chamber, there is a sense of reaching the boundary of use, where the purpose of storage meets the limits of the structure. The space feels more reflective here, inviting a quieter awareness of the environment and its role in holding what has been brought within. It is not a place of frequent activity, but one that contributes through its presence, offering a deeper layer to the overall system. In this way, even the furthest edges of the storage rooms participate in the slow, ongoing process of preserving what the land has provided.